I'm investigative journalist Molly Barrows. For years, I've covered the stories that made headlines in Northwest Florida and all along the Gulf Coast. Murders, missing persons, and mysteries of all kinds. These cases are far from over for many victims because the full story has yet to surface. Join me for Gulf Coast Confidential, where I dive into the saltier side of the South and expose the lies, greed, and corruption that often weighs down the truth. It's time to turn the tide and get a shot at justice. Hi, I'm Molly Barrows, and welcome to my investigative series, Gulf Coast Confidential. Here we cover some of the most scandalous crimes and cases that bubble up in Northwest Florida and beyond. Joining me to talk about these kind of what the feezies type stories is Pam Hill, a pharmacist and advocate for victims because she herself has experienced violent crime in her own family. Well, in this episode, we're talking about a case that we'll tap into Pam's pharmaceutical expertise for. It's called He Picked Her Poison. And we're talking about a former Mayo Clinic doctor, 30-year-old Dr. Connor Bowman, who has been indicted in Minnesota for the first-degree murder of his wife, 32-year-old pharmacist Betty Bowman, by poisoning her. Now, this is one salacious case, wouldn't you say, Pam?
It is. It's kind of weird and familiar, I guess, all the dosing and them both being healthcare professionals and probably just letting their guard down. Anyway, it is a what the feezy. I'm looking for the button for that.
I know. What the feezy, like how to give that reaction. So if you're not familiar with it, Bowman was arrested for murdering his wife in October and was recently indicted for first-degree murder for that crime. Now, according to friends, they had an open marriage, and apparently he had developed feelings for another woman. Betty started talking about divorce, and police believe at that point she was more valuable to him dead than alive because he had a lot of debt and a $500,000 life insurance policy on his wife. So that goes to his motive, police say, but let's talk about how he allegedly killed her, Pam. This is interesting, and I think you've got a lot of insight about this, but he apparently overdosed her with gout medication, something he would have known how to do because he was actually a poison specialist, which is it just seems like he really should have avoided, if you're going to kill somebody, don't do it in the way that you're clearly an expert at.
Your expertise. Well, and also he had been to pharmacy school too, they said. So now he is the poison control expert that people call and ask questions about overdoses or doses or whatever. And he had been doing some research on a very old drug, a drug named colchicine.
Right. It's a gout medication.
Right. And so gout, give me your hand for a second. Let me I'm going to pour this in your hand a little bit, or I'll pour it in mine or yours. Those are little rock candies.
Okay.
And that's what like little uric acid or gout crystals feel like in between your joints.
And that's painful?
Yes, very painful because it shards and it cuts the membranes and the muscles and stuff around your toe. Now, gout is basically called rich man's disease.
Yes.
Because usually older men get it, and they call it that, and it happens in the great toe. They never say the big toe. They say the great toe. So eating things like hollandaise sauce, Alfredo sauce, butter, mayonnaise, all that kind of stuff.
Things that are rich.
Yeah, things that are good and rich. Those things there. But this drug's been around since ancient times. They used to take it and make a paste out of it and put it on their joints when they're probably building the pyramids and stuff.
Wow.
So it's anti-inflammatory, mostly works for gout. There are a few other indications, but gout. So here's colchicine right here in a tablet. We don't sell a lot of that, but we sell some of it. There's anti-inflammatories that are like indomethacin, or there's Xylopram that help more than that. But colchicine is here, and I want to show you about these tablets on here. I'm using a little tray like we use in the pharmacy.
These are the tools of the trade for a pharmacist.
But a lot of them, and we got other stuff too. And we just like pour out the medicine there, and we don't touch all this medicine. Like if I need 5 of them, I'll count 5, and then if I need 10. And then you just pour the rest back in here like this, and the other in a bottle that we give to you after we label it and stuff. So that's colchicine. Now, in this case, this lady that's the pharmacist, his wife,
right,
she weighs 120 pounds. Well, when they started looking at what Connor was looking up, he was looking up gout, and he looked up how much colchicine is a toxic dose for a 120-pound woman. that happens to be how much Betty Bowman weighed.
Wow.
So he had to do some figuring. And he was crazy enough to look all this stuff up on his computers at work and at home. And he also looked up some other things. Can my searches be retrieved? And what about this?
I saw that. I thought that was interesting too, that, can this be used as evidence against me? And I'm like, well, in every case I've ever seen, it certainly
It always
can be.
is.
and it's too late if you're already searching for that.
Right, exactly. So he's a pharmacist and he's in medical school now. So, he could look it up on these package inserts, which you see these, they're big like this. This is a package insert like that.
Wow.
But that's what a poison control. It's big. It's like
a receipt
paper.
from CVS.
Yeah, right. Maybe that's why they're like that. But he has that at his fingertips. But so we had to figure out 120 pounds. And you can't just put that into theory. He's got to figure out if she weighs 120 pounds, you have to put that in kilograms. So you divide by 2.2. I know this is kind of boring, but we're getting somewhere with this.
Right.
Okay?
No, because it goes to show the level of calculation also.
And definitely, I would have used this if I was doing that, but I wouldn't be planning that in the first place. But I wouldn't be having it on my computer and phone.
Exactly. And what's interesting, too, is that he chose a medication that could potentially be prescribed. It's not like it's arsenic or some sort of unusual, clearly, fatal poison. It's something that might potentially elude notice.
Right. And I'll tell you why in a minute why I think he chose it, because it is weird. It's just so old. And used to the way you used to dose that, we would tell people take 2 tablets and then take another one an hour later. And then we say take another one after that, an hour, until you get diarrhea, and then back off one, and that's your dose. It sounds real professional.
Well, that's one heck of a boundary. Tell you what.
I think people will follow it.
I would notice when I found out that was the problem.
Yeah, so most people knew their dose back then. But that's when I first got out of pharmacy school in 1985. So that was a long time ago.
The best years.
The best years. So she weighs 120 pounds. We divide that by 2.2 because that's how you convert pounds to kilograms. And that means she weighs 54 kilograms just about. So he looked up what is the lethal dose of colchicine, and it just happens to be 0.8 milligrams per kilogram. So he multiplies that times 0.8, and he needs 43 milligrams of colchicine to make things toxic and miserable for her. So these are 0.6, so he'd have to use a whole lot of these and crush them up. But then he found some liquid colchicine online, and he bought it with some other stuff, and also an erectile dysfunction drug. That seems to be what people throw in.
If you're going to get free shipping, might as well take advantage.
You're killing me.
Good God.
But you have to throw that in there. So he ordered liquid. This isn't colchicine, but I want to show people how much it would take 12 ounces of liquid colchicine to get to this dose right
And
here.
this is 12 ounces here?
This is 12 ounces.
That's a lot.
Yeah. It's the same as like a canned soda is 12 ounces.
Wow.
So imagine what he did.
It's not like a shot. You know what I mean?
No,
Like
it's not.
if you were going to slip poison into somebody's coffee, this is way more than a cup of coffee.
You would think that would be so detectable.
Right.
Because this has a bitter taste and it's an artificial cherry taste. I haven't tasted it myself, but that's what the research says. And so that going into a smoothie. So Connor, he had made Betty a smoothie that night. They were staying home, and it was a big old smoothie.
Right.
And so he had to put this, and I think he put alcohol and some fruit and some ice. He made her a smoothie.
Yes. And just to let those folks who aren't familiar with the case know, this all happened in Minnesota in August of last year. And apparently, he made her the smoothie, and she had some of what's in the criminal complaint is that police said she had texted a friend that she had been talking to. And she was like, well, I'm home tonight having drinks with my husband. And then the next morning, she also texted the same person and said, I'm not feeling that great. I blame the smoothie that I drank with my husband that also had alcohol in it.
Right, exactly. And her friend had even tasted it and said, she kind of joked with her and said, he's trying to kill you for the reason that it tastes terrible. And then she also said, I thought to myself, he is trying to kill her because Connor never makes anything for anybody.
So it was unusual, almost like the old lady with the apple with Snow White.
Yes.
Here, go ahead and try this.
Right.
When this is not the normal MO.
Right. And that wasn't his personality either. His personality was kind of messy, and he didn't save money. He just kind of lived kind of harem-scarum type of thing. She was devoted, and she saved her money. She didn't have school debt or student loans like he did. He had almost $500,000 in student loans. which happens to be how much insurance he has on her.
So he had everything to gain
Mhm.
potentially from her death, as opposed to, and she had everything to just remain the same if they were to separate and go their, opposite ways.
Right. And they said she was sweet and fun and generous and loved her dog and loved people. And he was kind of like bookish and stuff, which is nothing wrong with that. But it just goes to show the different ways that they were. So they were trying to get into an open relationship, they said.
Yeah, I know that's interesting in and of itself. And apparently he had started dating someone that he had feelings for. She found out about it. She was not too keen on it. She was like, well, maybe we need to start talking about divorce. And, police started taking a closer look at him and, said to your point that maybe she was worth more to him dead than alive, that he had all this debt and she had nothing to lose by dropping him. He was dead weight, an albatross, if you will. If he didn't want to love and appreciate her for her, then she didn't need anything from him. She didn't have the debt. She didn't need his money. She was doing fine on her own. He needed her more than she needed him. And perhaps that was the problem too. But it's just tragic for her family because, to your point, they said how wonderful she was. But I think it's interesting, how he behaved after she got sick and later died. So she became ill. She ends up going to the emergency room at, I think it's St. Mary's, the Mayo Clinic there in Minnesota. And she had stomach pains, and she passed away, I think, in August of 2023, on August 2016. She passed away 4 days later after she checked herself in on that date in the ER. And she had terrible stomach distress, they were saying. And then as her condition worsened, she had heart problems. There was fluid buildup in her lungs. They removed part of her colon, which I thought was interesting. And I think you've got some insight on that. Before she died of organ failure 4 days after she checked herself into the ER on August 16th. So why would they need to remove part of her colon? What would colchicine do to that?
Well, it doesn't surprise me that she presented with those symptoms like that, GI distress, maybe nausea, vomiting, and they even thought maybe she had food poisoning. And the way that some of these drugs just rip through your intestines. I know that doesn't sound polite, but that's what they do. They just wreak havoc in there. That's why they call them cathartic. They're kind of cleansing. So she presents with that. So this colchicine poisoning looks much like food poisoning. But the reason that she would have to have part of her colon removed, one reason would be, is that she had some necrotic tissue, which is dead tissue. I don't know if it was there before or if it was this. Colchicine can start working anywhere within 30 minutes to an hour. And especially if the dose is huge, it's just going to start doing its thing. That's why it's selected sometimes, because gout's very painful. People can't even stand to have the covers on their foot when they have gout. They can't stand for the air conditioner to blow across it. And I'm talking about these are grown men mostly, because my dad had it in the hospital once, and he never complains, but he kept saying, my toe hurts. And I was like, how weird, but I didn't know he had gout.
Your great toe, Daddy?
Yeah. My toe is great. Yeah. But yeah, it was that. So I saw firsthand how gout hurts. So it's going through there, and just from 4 days after she had that smoothie, the poison smoothie, she goes into the hospital. She's at the Mayo. She's there with people that know her. And so she's getting the best care. So I don't know what happened in those 4 days. They didn't tell all the details, but what I did read is it was gastrointestinal and just miserable for her.
Yeah, what a terrible way to go. And it's interesting that after she passed, he tried to pressure the medical examiner into not doing an autopsy and to having his wife cremated immediately. He wanted to claim that her death was quote unquote natural. And this is all according to the criminal complaint that was filed in Minnesota. But the medical examiner wasn't having it. He did perform an autopsy and determined that she did die of colchicine toxicity and ruled her death a homicide. So it's interesting, in the obituary that ran for Betty Bowman, which it would seem that he wrote, according to police, Connor wrote, and perhaps you can help me pronounce this correctly, but the acronym is HLH, and it's a rare illness in which the immune system attacks the body's organs. And it's this long word that I will, completely just mess up if I try to say. But essentially, he said that his wife died, quote unquote, following a sudden onset of autoimmune and infectious illness. but it's something she was actually never diagnosed with. And the medical examiner's office notified Rochester police that her death was suspicious for all of these things, and including the colchicine toxicity. So as police started looking into it, they talked to her friends. They tell her, yeah, Betty was in an open relationship. There were infidelity problems. There were other issues. The couple even had separate bank accounts. To your point, she was doing well. He had debt. She was separating herself from that. And again, like I said before, on the very night before she was hospitalized, she was texting another man that she was having drinks with her husband, and the next day said, I feel sick from this smoothie. So, police certainly had plenty of evidence, a breadcrumb trail to follow, if you will.
Yeah, definitely. I think a red flag is when someone's yelling, no autopsy and let's cremate them as soon as we can. We see that in a lot of these stories. And he's a healthcare professional, and it wouldn't have surprised me if he really did get to create that narrative, because he dang sure was trying really hard to do that.
Well, it's interesting, and you and I are going to get into this in another case that we're going to be discussing here on Gulf Coast Confidential called Me and the M.E., and it's about the murder case of William Cybers' wife, Kay Cybers, who died in 1991 in Panama City, right here on the Gulf Coast of Florida. And, he was essentially ended up it's a convoluted case, and we're going to get into it, but essentially he ended up pleading guilty to killing her, and it was another case of poisoning. And he was in a position of authority. He was in a position as the medical examiner for that district to hide what he had done, and to try to cover up his tracks. He had her embalmed almost immediately. So it's interesting that these, white men in positions of influence and power, if you will, including Connor Bowman, are going to try to dictate the narrative. And in 1991, that was a lot easier to do than it is in 2023.
Definitely, because there wasn't a lot of checking behind. Some of these people are lucky that they committed their crimes when they did, because we didn't have all the wonderful technology we have now. So
yeah, and so that kind of, not to interrupt, but that kind of made me think about, with Connor Bowman, like, okay, you're going to go ahead and Google all of these things? Why not just leave a digital trail, like right to your doorstep?
Right. And I'm thinking, like, in pharmacy school, when I got out of pharmacy school, this is what we had. We still were typing on typewriters. It was right when things were changing.
So much easier to plot someone's demise.
The old-timey way.
No digital trail of evidence.
We would use this, the package insert, which is big like a poster, get out your own little calculator and calculate the dose there, but he left. He basically was going around creating straw men, and I'll tell you what I think about that in a minute, as the medical examiner was doing what I call throwing the monkey wrench in there. So there's always some sort of thought process or deviance or just dastardly thinking. And as I read this, I'm like, how could you be a healthcare professional and even think about doing this to anybody, much less your wife?
Right.
So I feel like Connor Bowman created those straw men by starting his wife's obituary off with, she died of HLH, an autoimmune and infectious disease, explaining it to everybody like he's a third-year medical student type of thing.
Like that's what's on everybody's mind after she passed.
Right. And then he went on to say he put her beloved dog and put that, it was kind of bland. It was vanilla. It was just like, I didn't even like read it. Yeah. And he put himself in there also, but no mention of her family in there, and it was just vanilla, and he just did that, I think, because I know some people do that, maybe say they died of a sudden illness so they don't have to answer so many questions at the funeral home, type of thing. But this was like a bit much. This was creating the narrative and a straw man.
Absolutely, and it kind of goes to what police were saying, that he did not behave at all like a grieving husband, and that's what the friends were saying as well. Like when they, talked to him about his wife's death, he was very stoic. He didn't show a lot of emotion. And, within days of her passing, he had the girlfriend there at his apartment. He had removed all pictures of Betty in the apartment as well. So that's not the actions of someone who is just heartbroken and grieving over the loss of their wife.
Right. And everybody grieves differently. We say that all the time. But typically people will show some emotion about their wife or significant other or somebody they loved. So it was all just weird, and it was just him creating this little stew.
I know, and it's so sad, and it's interesting about the fallout of it too. I was looking him up in the jail in the county where he's being held, and he's being held on $2 million bond.
Mm.
He had originally been charged back in October is when he was charged, even though she passed in August because they had done their investigating, but with like second-degree murder. So a grand jury indicted him on first-degree murder, and those are the charges that will now take precedent, and he faces life in prison if convicted. But I did find it was interesting also in the clerk of court in that area, the apartment complex where he lived with his wife has filed eviction notice, and he has since moved out. And they said that he essentially violated his lease by murdering his wife there.
Wow, I would say so.
I know, but I thought that was fascinating because, you hear a lot of situations where people take a side, if you will, and we're all innocent until proven guilty. He has not been convicted. Let me make that clear. He has been charged and arrested for this and is in jail awaiting, his trial. But in the meantime, I think that was interesting that this apartment complex, the owners of this apartment took the time to say, hey, this is wrong. We want him out. And any, charges that we have to ensue this, he needs to pay them. And he's the one that broke the lease. He's the one that violated it by committing this crime. And this is wrong.
Right.
And, you think about other crimes where people commit it and there's perhaps this lackadaisical, well, whatever, as long as I'm getting my rent, it doesn't matter. But I thought that was interesting.
Oh, yeah, that was very principled. Like I said, people are like water sometimes. They take the path of least resistance. But what I was thinking about with all this, I'm like, how much in the world could you both have going for you?
I know.
You're fixing to be a doctor. He's still going to have some more debt. He's still in medical school. She's got a doctorate in pharmacy. She's a doctor. She's a PharmD. And so they're young. They're in their mid-30s. She's got her dog. And then I don't know what happened, if they fell out of love or what have you, but I never been married, but so I'm an expert. So if I don't understand why, even if things are going wrong, why would you introduce something else that could go terribly wrong? Because we're talking about people's feelings and emotions, but these two educated people said, okay, we can have an open relationship as long as nobody develops feelings or emotions. No, they're educated. Even if you aren't educated, you know that that's not going to happen.
I know, but that is the difference between the analytical side of our brains, isn't it? And then the emotional side of our beings, because I think there's this desire, whether people want to be honest or not, that they maybe they're bored, maybe they're unhappy, maybe they're dissatisfied for whatever reason. So they're still looking for something outside of their relationship to fill that void, to fill that hole. And to your point, in my experience, especially in news, so many heinous crimes that led to murder started with sex problems, if you will. People stepping out. It was jealousy. It was unrequited love. It was people being upset. It was, but so often the case with men and women, if men fall in love with somebody else, it's like, well, I got me a new one. I don't need this old one, and I don't want to pay for the old one while I got a new one. I want to dump all my money into my bank account and my new one's bank account. I don't want to pay for the old one. And I hate to be cold and cruel like that, but that's what it boils down to. And I've said it before, but like so many times, like I think even in this case, if what police are saying is true and it was about his debt, it was about his life and his convenience and him moving on, and she was just in the way, and just this totally, entirely self-centered way of looking at life. They just don't see beyond the moment. This is what's going to make me happy. Not, gee, I think police are going to take a hard look when my perfectly healthy wife one day is fine and then dies the next. And I'm just going to write this obituary and everybody's going to believe what I say because I want him to. And I got my new girl. I got my new piece, not to be crude, but that's what it is. He's just got a new one. She ain't no different from the other one. She's just new.
Right. Well, it kind of reminds me of the Ben Brown case because I'll say everything I'm going to say, and I'm so brilliant and handsome and charming, and I've gotten away with it all these years. Surely you're going to believe me.
Yeah, exactly. And I just don't think they realize how transparent they are to other people. And maybe because some people don't necessarily recognize the narcissism or the phony charm, if you will. But Pam's referring to Dr. Ben Brown. He's a Gulf Breeze plastic surgeon. And if you'd like to learn more about that, the death of his wife, Hillary Brown, is under investigation by the Santa Rosa County Sheriff's Office here in the Panhandle of Florida because she died under unusual circumstances while he was performing several procedures on her back in November of 2023. She went into cardiac arrest. She died a week later. They had to take her off life support because her brain went without oxygen for just too long. So that investigation's ongoing. But if you'd like to hear more about it, and we do have an update, but the original story that we did on it is called Beauty Buyer Beware. And I do have new information out in the Pensacola News Journal, pnj.com online, and we're going to do another update on that case as well. But it is interesting when you have people in the medical field, and we can talk about that in my follow-up to Beauty Buyer Beware too, and also with Brandon's case, because there was also a doctor that your sister had consulted. And again, for those who are familiar, you've probably heard Mommy Killer 1 and 2, but that's a recap essentially of what happened with Pam's sister Sharon Ate-A-Lot, who was murdered by her own son. Pam's nephew Brandon Ate-A-Lot back in 2010. So, or not 2010, I'm sorry, 2013. So at any rate, there's a lot of details in that case that I think kind of go along with what you're talking about. There was a doctor that Sharon tried to consult. He also was in a position to potentially help her. And he did say that he tried, but it didn't really amount to much help for Brandon. But these men who are in positions of influence in the medical community do seem to take it for granted that their word is just going to be enough.
And it has been that way a lot. We have like what we call a demigod syndrome, where we worship people that have an education and
quit questioning them.
We don't ask normal questions. And I think that's part of like all this other stuff, like when most people haven't had plastic surgery over and over and over again. I found like this, I'm having to kind of do that with the legal system. I've never had to deal with murder in my life. But here I am learning a whole new thing, and I do question things, not to be disrespectful or anything. I want to understand why, because here's what I'm seeing with all the things that we're doing these cases on. People are killing each other when they could just get a divorce. I don't advocate all that, just the easy way out and all that, but I advocate that more than murder. We both have a friend, and her name's Pat. She said she put her divorce on layaway. She went into a lawyer, put it on layaway. When I make that last payment, there we go. And that's what she did.
Yeah.
So that's how that went. But also I get
She wasn't trying to have it all or nothing.
Right.
There's a sacrifice that comes with ending a marriage if you're trying to do it legally.
Right. And then just part ways or what have you. I mean, this is pretty apparent to me. And like you said, this is all alleged. But he's got $500,000 life insurance. He's got $500,000 worth of debt, got a new girlfriend. I mean, 1, 2, 3, it's not that hard. And all this other stuff going on. And then I get to thinking about, we've been doing this since the beginning of time.
Right.
Cain and Abel. Every time I read Cain and Abel, even when I read it when I was a little girl, I was like, he killed his brother.
People who don't take responsibility for what they do, that's when the trouble starts.
Right.
And that's essentially what it is. He didn't want to divorce her and be stuck with his own debt. He saw a way to make himself happier.
But they just don't see. We see it. You can see through.
I know,
it.
And that's
beautiful.
And are those some of your takeaways from this case?
Some of my takeaways is people need to quit doing that. If you're not happy, separate, get a divorce, go separate ways. Don't kill each other. And then people, after they do that, they want everybody to protect them.
I know. And that's what's so interesting, too. At least in this case, her family, has gotten a chance to be heard and talk about what a lovely person that she was and how much she enjoyed her work as a pharmacist. She worked in the operating room pharmacy at the Mayo Clinic. She was beloved by her colleagues. They've started a GoFundMe page, in fact, to help, basically raise money for all of the expenses that are associated with this. And her family did say, as new evidence emerges, we realize Betty might have been taken from us, not by natural causes. And it doesn't mention her husband, but certainly they're aware of the outpouring of support. And so my takeaways are, don't have an open relationship. If an open relationship is something that you're leaning towards, then perhaps it's time to take a hard look and say, am I even happy in this relationship that I have?
Yeah.
Because once you open that door, in my experience in news, those are some of the most heinous crimes. And that's the worst case scenario. And just in the regular average walk of life scenario, I actually know 2 different couples, one that did open their marriage and they're still together. And I think it was simply because it just worked for them for this brief amount of time. It's not anything I would recommend, but it didn't end in anybody's murder and it didn't end in the end of their relationship. But I do know of another couple that had an open relationship and things progressed and then they ended up splitting up because they each found essentially somebody else. And so if that's where you're going and if that works for you, I live in a glass house. I'm not passing judgment. We all certainly need to be careful of judging other people, but I feel like that's when you're opening the door to some major problems because that's just not how a normal relationship works. And if it works for people, great. But I would think for the average person, that's how deception can come in. That's how lies can come in. That's how, evil can come in and somebody ends up dead. In this case, it's Betty Connor.
Right. And I think about like people that get married. Like I said, never been married, so I'm the expert on it all. But you take an oath. You want to be together. You've invited all these people to come to a party to watch you say this, and yet you going to either kill them and sometimes even get a divorce. Sometimes things can work out if you're willing to take it on yourself and own your own stuff.
Right, exactly. But that's the hard part.
That's the hard part.
Killing somebody and just paying off your debts, it probably seems like the easy way out.
But it seems worse to me.
Certainly for her. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, Pam, thank you so much. I appreciate you weighing in on this and sharing your pharmaceutical expertise.
Thanks.
And that's it for us for He Picked Her Poison. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Gulf Coast Confidential. I'm your host, writer, and producer, Molly Barrows, with co-host and researcher, Pam Hill. And a big thanks, as always, to our director, editor, and production engineer, James Roy. You can listen to more of Gulf Coast Confidential and our conversations wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And you can also watch on the Gulf Coast Confidential YouTube channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.